Curious George. Curious George is the main character of a series of popular children's books and TV series of the same name, written by Margret and H. A. Ray. George, who is referred to as a monkey in the books, was brought from his home in Africa by the man with the yellow hat. They are best friends and they live together in the city and the country. When the first story, Cecily G. and the Nine Monkeys, was published in France in 1939, George was named Sirocco. In the United Kingdom, George was originally called Zozo in 1941, apparently to avoid using the name of the then King George VI for an ape. Books featuring the adventures of Curious George have been translated from the original French into many other languages in addition to English. The books have been adapted into several television series and films. Creation. The original series was written by the husband and wife team of Hans Augusto H. A. Ray and Margret Ray. The Jewish couple fled Paris in June 1940 on self-made bicycles, carrying the Curious George manuscript with them. At first, only H. A. Ray was credited for the work in order to distinguish the Ray's books from the large number of children's books written by female authors. The first 7 books were illustrated by H. A. Ray. Later, Alan J. Shalleck was credited for the illustrations and Hans Ray and Margret Ray for the writing. The Rays produced many other children's books, but the Curious George series was the most popular. Each book has been in continuous print since it was first published. Literature. Margret and H. A. Ray released 7 Curious George books during H. A. Ray's lifetime. Recently, more Curious George books have been released by Houghton Mifflin Harcourt, including board books with scenes from the original books, books adapted from the 1980s Telefilms series, and new adventures. Original adventures. Curious George appeared in 1941. This book begins with George living in Africa and tells the story of his capture by the man with the yellow hat, who takes him on a ship to the big city where he will live in a zoo. The second book, Curious George Takes a Job 1947, begins with George living in the zoo, from which he escapes and has several adventures before the man with the yellow hat finds him and takes George to live at his house. The remaining 5 stories describe George's adventures while living at the house of the man with the yellow hat. Sometimes dubbed the original adventures, these original 7 titles are completely by the series creators, Margret and H. A. Ray. Curious George 1941. Curious George Takes a Job 1947. Curious George Rides a Bike 1952. Curious George Gets a Medal 1957. Curious George Flies a Kite 1958. Curious George Learns the Alphabet 1963. Curious George Goes to the Hospital 1966 before appearing in his own series. Curious George appeared as a character in another children's book written and illustrated by H. A. Ray, Cecily G., and the Nine Monkeys 1939. Books adapted from Telefilms. A second series of books, based on the Telefilm series, was edited by Margret and H. A. Ray and Alan J. Shalleck. These appeared between 1984 and 1993. They are mostly out of print, though several have been re-released with new cover art. New Adventures. A third series of books, The Curious George New Adventures, began to appear in 1998 and continues to the present. These books are illustrated in the style of H. A. Ray by a variety of credited and uncredited artists including Mary O'Keefe Young, Martha Weston, Anna Grossnickel-Hines, Michael Allen Jensen, and Vipa Interactive. The Man in the Yellow Hat. Aside from George himself, the only recurring character in the original adventures is the man with the yellow hat, who is Georgie's best friend. The man often facilitates Georgie's adventures by taking him somewhere, and even more often resolves the tension by intervening just in time to get George out of a tight spot. He is always seen wearing a bright yellow suit and a wide-brimmed yellow hat. The man is never mentioned by name in the original adventures, or in any subsequent content over more than 6 decades. He is always referred to as the man or fully the man with the yellow hat. When people speak to George about the man, they often refer to him as your friend. However, in Curious George 2006, the man, who is voiced by Will Ferrell, is referred to as Ted as his real name throughout the film, and his last name is revealed as being Shackleford in a deleted scene. In the TV series, he is voiced by Jeff Bennett. Other media. Curious George was so successful that it was adapted into a television show, magazine, and video game. Television. A set of animated Curious George television films were produced from 1979 to 1982. They were first shown in the United States in 1984 on Nickelodeon. This series was produced and co-written by Alan Shellek. The shorts were aired on the Disney Channel as a segment on the program Lunchbox starting in 1989. In 1993, Margret Ray successfully sued Lafferty, Harwood, and Partners, the Canadian company that funded the cartoons, for licensing VHS tapes to third-party companies without the Rays' permission. The Rays eventually won the dispute, forcing Lafferty, Harwood, and Partners to pay for all wrongdoing. A new Curious George series debuted on September 4, 2006 on PBS Kids as part of the PBS Kids preschool block. Although Curious George ended its original run on April 1, 2015, the series is still airing on PBS Kids in reruns. It was produced by the Boston affiliate WGBH, Imagine Entertainment, and Universal Animation Studios. A revival of the series was released on the streaming service Peacock on July 15, 2020. Season 10 premiered on PBS on October 5, 2020. Film. A 2017 film, Monkey Business, The Adventures of Curious George's creators, documents the lives of Hans and Margret Ray, including their flight from France during the 1940 invasion by Germany, their life in the United States, and their creation of the Curious George children's books. Animated. A minimal animation 16mm film called Curious George Rides a Bike was produced by Westonwood Studios in 1958. In 1984, they created another short, again based on the book of the same name. Produced by Churchill Films, the films were created with puppet figures. Matthews later used a similar technique for his films of Frog and Toad. An animated film, Curious George, featuring Will Ferrell as the voice of the originally unnamed man with the yellow hat, was released on February 10, 2006. In this film, in which the man is referred to as Ted, Curious George secretly follows the man onto the ship to the city on his own accord. Frank Welker provided the vocal effects of Curious George. Ron Howard serves as the film's producer. On March 2, 2010, a direct-to-video sequel to the film was released, titled Curious George 2: Follow That Monkey, which featured Jeff Bennett replacing Ferrell as the voice of the man. Bennett also provides the man's voice in the television series. The second direct-to-video sequel, Curious George 3: Back to the Jungle, was released on June 23, 2015. Curious George Royal Monkey was released on September 10, 2019. Curious George Go West, Go Wild was released on Peacock on September 20, 2020. A sixth film, Curious George Cape Ahoy, finished development and was released on Peacock on September 30, 2021. A Christmas film, Curious George A Very Monkey Christmas, was released in 2009 on PBS. Curious George Swings into Spring and Curious George, a Halloween Boo Fest, were released in 2013. On Monday, August 6, it began to rerun on Cartoonito. Live-action/CGI animated. A live-action/computer animated film was in development at Illumination Entertainment in the beginning of the 2010s. In August 2016, it was reported that Andrew Adamson, was in negotiations to direct, co-write, and executive produce the live-action film for Universal Pictures, along with Ron Howard, Brian Grazer, David Kirshner, John Shapiro, and Erica Huggins producing it. Video game. There is also a Curious George video game that was released on February 2, 2006, published by Namco and developed by Monkey Bar Games, a division of Vicious Cycle Software, for Microsoft Windows, Xbox, GameCube, PlayStation 2, and Game Boy Advance. A version for the Nintendo DS was also planned but was cancelled. Other. A children's bookstore in Harvard Square, Cambridge, Massachusetts, was known as Curious George and Friends, formerly Curious George Goes to Wordsworth, and carried a considerable amount of licensed Curious George merchandise. It was the last remaining property of Wordsworth Books, a former local general interest bookstore that closed in the beginning of the 2000s. This store was closed in June 2011. A new store opened in 2012 at the same address, called the world's only Curious George store, Harvard Square. VE Corporation, the company behind Sesame Street Live, is mounting Curious George Live. It is a brand new national tour featuring song and dance and Curious George himself. It is based on the PBS animated series. Curious George is used as the theme for children's play areas and some of the children's entertainment on the Stena Line ferries. On some peak time sailings, this includes a Curious George costumed character. Curious George merchandise is also provided with children's meals and is available to purchase in the onboard shop. A Curious George themed water play area, called Curious George Goes to Town, has been a minor attraction in Feebles Playland at Universal Studios Florida since 1998. This attraction is temporarily closed due to the COVID-19 pandemic. The attraction also featured at Universal Studios Hollywood until its removal in 2013. In February 2006, the Curious George brand joined with Welch's Jelly for a collectible of 6 jars. In the latter part of that decade, when the new film and the new television show were released, licensing deals for the character generally involved less upscale, more kid-focused products. Earlier, Vivendi Universal, now NBC Universal, had, for a short time, embraced the use of the character in a series of 2001 adverts for the company, but the character never officially became a corporate mascot. In the film Forrest Gump of 1994, one edition of Curious George won with a yellow cover, but no other title than Curious George is used as Forrest's favorite book, which his mother reads to him. In the opening scene, a feather comes floating down to Forrest's feet, and he stores it in this book. At the end of the film, it falls out of the book and rises floating through the air again. Jarrod, the titular character and protagonist from the NBC series The Pretender, read Curious George books in Season 1 and developed a fascination with them. He likened himself to George and Sidney Green, the psychiatrist whom he saw as a surrogate father to the man with the yellow hat. The books have inspired others, for example Bangkok Bob, written for and published by Big Brother Mouse, a Lao publishing project. Translations. The character has been translated variously into other languages. Afrikaans, Ienaar Dij Georged, Georged. Catalan, Jordi El Curios. Danish, Peter Pedal. Dutch, Niels Jurig 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 Finnish, Utilias villain. French, Georges le Singed. German, Coco. Galician, Gol. Hebrew, Gverd HSQRNTR George Ha Sakran, previously KHVNY HSQRN Koni Ha Sakran, as translated by Pue Hirschlag. Hungarian Bajkavero Magim Troublemaker Monkey. Italian Curioso cum George 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 Icelandic Fritjofer Forvitnini Japanese Asaranaziozi tr Asaru no Joji 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 no Joji 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 no Joji 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 Macedonian Ljubopitni Djorj tr Ljubopitni Djorj Korean Hajasim Joji tr Hajasim Mainen Joji Norwegian Nisgerij Nils Polish Sikoski George Ki George George Portuguese Giorgio Curioso Romanian Curioso George 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 Russian Lyubopitny Djorj tr Serbian Radiznali Djorj tr Radiznali Djorj Spanish George El Curioso Swedish Nick Nifeikin Turkish Murakli Meymun Yiddish DZSHR DZSH DR Nigrik RTR DZ Shords Der Nagereiker